So I'm David with East West Books in Mountain View. Yes, again, we are very pleased to be here again with Mitch Horowitz. Mitch is a historian of alternative spirituality and one of today's most literate voices of esoterica, mysticism, and the occult. He's among the few occult writers whose work touches upon the basis of academic scholarship, national journalism, and the subculture cred. Mitch is a writer in residence at the New York Public Library, a lecturer in residence at the Philosophical Research Society in Los Angeles, and the PEN Award-winning historian whose books include Occult America, One Simple Idea, How Positive Thinking Reshaped the Modern Life, and Miracle Club. Tonight, he's going to be sharing with us his adventures in uncertain places, and we're very happy for him to share what's already turned out to be a bestseller on Amazon as soon as it came out. So this is a very exciting talk, and we're greatly looking forward to it. There'll be a recording sent out to all of you in the next 24 hours after we're done with this evening, and we'll have a little time at the end for a Q&A. And if people feel a little camera shy, they can go ahead and type their questions into the chat, and or we can use their hand raising emoji, and to let you open it up for dialogue with Mitch. But with that being said, I'm gonna butt out of the way, and Mitch Horowitz, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Dave. And it's good to be here with y'all. This book is kind of a dream come true for me because it summarizes a lot of what I've experienced in considering the practicality, the reality, the applicability of the extra-physical over the past several years. And I notice whenever you make an effort to collect your work, there's always the sensation of some sort of a turning of a page. And I'm not sure, quite frankly, what that turning of a page for me personally represents, just as I'm sure for all of you, when you hit some sort of a milestone in life, you're not altogether sure what comes next. So that's part of the uncertainty that's implicit in the title of the book. I've also noticed, looking back over the years, that I've changed my point of view on certain things, and I'm going to be very explicit about that tonight. But I would say that there's nothing I've ever written that I feel the urge to disavow. I think it's healthful, it's natural that all of us go through periods of reassessment of what we believe. For example, and this is really just an aside by way of supporting my point, many years ago in 2014, maybe that's not quite that many years ago, but it certainly feels like a long time ago, I wrote a piece for Time magazine on how to ring in the new year and make it a better year. And there were things I included in that piece that are no longer a focus for me. For example, in that piece, I described an ethic of radical forgiveness, make an effort to forgive anyone who's done something hurtful to you, violative to you, no matter what the offense. I don't feel that way anymore, and I'm going to talk about that further tonight. But at the same time, I don't feel any sense of embarrassment over that piece. I don't have the wish to take my name off of it or do anything that signals some sort of an apology or second thoughts perspective, because I feel quite certain that forgiveness probably does play a very productive and forwarding role in a lot of people's lives. There's lots of people in the recovery movement, for example, for whom forgiveness is a basic tenet of their spiritual path and their path to sobriety or to dealing with whatever addiction is facing them. And we all face addictions. And I think that if anybody were to present me with a piece that I wrote, I don't know, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and I found that I had a different point of view, I wouldn't in any way feel a sense that I was required to disavow or where I was before. Once, not long ago, I was speaking to somebody who asked me about my penchant for getting tattoos, and he wondered whether there was a kind of expiration on what some of the images meant to me. And he said to me, I would never want to get a tattoo because what if I get a tattoo and then I feel differently about something or what have you? And my attitude is that everything demarcates something that mattered to us, something that was central to us, something that was useful to us at a certain point in life. And it's quite rare that we don't see or experience things as building blocks in our own lives, even if we've moved on from the emphasis that we once gave to those things or the certainty with which we once held to those things. If it weren't for radical departures or sometimes gradual departures in my own path, I think I would feel a tremendous sense of stagnancy. My deepest wish, I suppose, as a speaker, as a writer, is that I never want to hear myself giving a kind of stump speech. And if I find myself issuing ideas and thoughts that are kind of my standard issue line on things, something is wrong. And something is wrong in terms of my willingness to be vulnerable and exposed and transparent to you all who I see as co-seekers on the path. Some years ago, I recorded 2 seasons of a talk show called One Simple Idea for a new age streaming network called the New Thought Channel, which has since gone bankrupt. I might say something about the wisdom of programming me. And sorry, Dave, that was no aspersion on our event this evening. And so this talk show was very simple, where I was just having conversations with people who were from the New Thought or New Age cultural space. And to be quite frank, this is not going to be a great advertisement for the show, but I have to be honest with you. I personally found the experience, I mean, it was exciting to the extent that I was eager to be on camera and try out my hand as an interviewer and as a host and so forth. And all of that was very gratifying. But to some degree, I found it a boring exercise because I felt that the responses that I was frequently getting from some of my interlocutors were very packaged and very neatly rendered in such a way that wouldn't permit exposure of their own personal doubts, crises, fallacies. And it was difficult to kind of bring this out of people because they were nervous about displaying vulnerability. There was a sense that, well, you know, I'm supposed to be a metaphysical minister or a leader within the New Thought or New Age thought space. And rather than frankly discuss some of their own problems on the path, problems that we all face, there was an inclination to go into kind of political speech mode. I'm obviously not talking about political in a partisan sense, but to go into that sort of marketing mode. And I hope that I never do that, because if I do, I'm violating the principle of uncertain places as a title and as a testimony. I obviously have a very deep belief in the existence of an extra-physical. And I feel that the existence of the extra-physical, which is my definition of spirituality, is something that we all partake in. And I'm going to be very specific a little bit later about what I mean by that. And I think that a belief in the extra-physical is uniquely important to those of us on the path, because one of the things that I raise in uncertain places is whether that belief in and of itself helps to facilitate the very results that we're looking for. And that's a key part of my search today. In the late 19th century, William James, the American philosopher, who is a real intellectual hero to me, made the statement, I think this was in 1895 in an essay called Is Life Worth Living? He made the statement that he saw no reason to conclude that an individual's belief in what James called God would not in itself facilitate the results and the experiences of belief in the life of the individual, not just in a way that arose from expectation or prejudice or what is called confirmation bias, but in an actual concrete way. So, for example, when people are involved in studies of the placebo response, the appearance of a therapeutic event in the life of the individual, if there's any placebo response at all, rests on hopeful expectancy. It rests on the very belief that something is possible, something is present. And a core part of my search at this moment is whether belief in the extraphysical itself is sufficient to help us to bypass maybe some of the methods and techniques and liturgies to which we are accustomed. And I prescribe some of these methods and techniques and liturgies, and I use some of them myself. But there are times, and I had this happen to me just in the last 24 hours, where I might feel a certain resistance, where I think to myself, maybe I'm burning with a desire for something, some form of expression or some achievement, or maybe wanting to reach out to somebody whose work I admire, and I'm not sure if I have a clear path to reaching that person. And I felt this just last night. I didn't want to sit down and do the sigil, for those of you who work with chaos magic. I didn't want to sit down and write down the resolution or the affirmation. I even, heresy of heresies, did not want to start anew on my own 30-day mental challenge, which is an exercise that I frequently prescribe, right? Jennifer is like, damn you. And it's like the priest admitting, he's an atheist. And I do plan to start that, but I didn't feel like it last night. And I wasn't sure why precisely, but maybe it's something that you all have experienced at different times. And I'm going to leave us a healthy amount of time to have questions and exchange. Sarah, I'm so glad to see you're vaping, because I intend to vape during this presentation. I'm very proud of myself. I quit smoking, and now I'm simply addicted to glycerin vapor with nicotine. So I'd like to believe that that's healthier. Yeah. And I'm just going to persist in telling myself that. And but to get back to my story, I felt something that I really feel that some of you all might have felt as well, where there are times that we, or certainly I, don't want to leave the wish, the thought, the thing that we're holding with passionate focus to start saying a prayer or writing a list or doing an exercise or making a sigil or what have you. Even sometimes we don't want to stop and meditate. And those things all have their place. They all have their place. But there are times where I just want to sit with the wish itself. And one of the experiments that I'm working with right now, and I would invite you to join me in working with this experiment if it's of interest to you. And I'd like to hear your results. If you ever want to send me an email or contact me on social media, I'd be very eager to hear about it. I wonder if the belief itself in the extraphysical selective properties of thought, which I am absolutely convinced is a valid belief, is a justified belief, is a supported reasonable and evidence-based belief, whether that belief in and of itself is enough to free us from form, and whether the wish, the impassioned wish, held with conviction and focus and good definition, is in itself sufficient to free up the causative agencies of thought. One of the reasons I spend so much time, especially recently, especially say over the past year and a half, writing and speaking about psychical research, parapsychology, ESP research, is because I think that that is really super clear evidence gathered along the lines of a Western model of statistical gathering, replication, meta-analysis. And this data has stood up over decades and decades and decades. It keeps coming. It keeps proving replicable. I think that that data, among other things, because there are lots of testimonies and experiences that are a good deal more dramatic than that data, but I think that that material helps imbue in the seeker a warranted, justified belief in the extra physicality of thought. And I think that other models, such as some of the most dynamic interpretations of data to come out of quantum mechanics, also serves almost as a logical necessity to validate that there are an infinitude of things going on at once. If on the particle scale, and I must point out it's not the particle scale alone anymore, but if on the particle scale, which is where most of the classical experiments have taken place, an object is in a state of superposition or a wave state or a state of infinitude, up and until the instant when a measurement is taken, either by a sentient observer or by an automatized device, it not only stands to reason, but it's a logical imperative that infinite outcomes, infinite events are playing out around us all at once and become localized only with perspective, only with perception. You know, the truth is, all of the founders of quantum mechanics were what would be called philosophical idealists. They believed in the perceptual basis of reality. This was true of Max Planck. This was true, maybe grudgingly, of Erwin Schrödinger. This was true of Hugh Everett, who pioneered the many worlds theory of quantum mechanics, which is really what I've just been describing. All the founders, really, of world-class science as we know it in the 21st century were philosophical idealists. They believed that perception, or what I might call selection, was absolutely fundamental to the definition of reality as we experience it in concrete ways, in actual ways. I would also hasten to add, as I often do, we experience many different laws and forces, and that law of selection or mental causation or mentality can be conditioned by a lot of different things. As I say recently, water is always water. It's always H2O, but it can be a vapor, it can be a liquid, or it can be a solid, depending upon surrounding circumstances. So I don't see why a natural law of mental selectivity wouldn't also be subject to different circumstances. But there's something that makes me feel very joyful in this, if I can put it that way. And that is that if one really studies the implications of quantum mechanics, if one really studies what's going on in the most adventuresome experiments in the placebo response, in fields like neuroplasticity, in fields like ESP research, it becomes almost incontrovertible that your mind possesses selective properties, that your mind possesses participates in a reality selection, no matter how many barriers might sometimes appear to intervene in that process. And there are barriers. There are barriers, and there may also be very concrete physical limits that we have to experience, such as bodily decline, death, tremendously difficult countervailing events like health crises and things of this nature. And yet there is a persistent, replicable, dynamic, and extraordinary truth in the mind's causative abilities. There are certain physicians who have come to feel that the greatest impetus for healing when the individual is facing a stress-related disease like hypertension or chronic back pain or maybe irritable bowel syndrome, when an individual is facing a chronic stress-related disease, there are certain physicians who have made the observation that the very knowledge, the very understanding, the justified, truthful, fact-based understanding that their disease has a stress component in and of itself serves a healing function. There was a professor of orthopedics at NYU Medical School who died several years ago named John Sarno, S-A-R-N-O, John Sarno. And Sarno was considered one of the world-class specialists in treating people who were suffering from stress-related back or neck pain. And Sarno referred to his approach as knowledge therapy. He would bring patients into his exam room. He would explain to them very meticulously and truthfully exactly why stress can result in chronic back or neck pain. And he would simply give them the facts. And the patient, just availing him or herself of the facts, in Sarno's, according to Sarno's clinical records, very frequently experience substantial and lasting relief just through the capacity to bring mental awareness, and I suppose to feel a sense of emotional relief that this chronic pain that they were suffering was not some mysterious, implacable thing that would necessarily require invasive surgery or meds that might have side effects that they might not want to deal with, or maybe long stretches of arduous physical therapy, which is sometimes necessary. But in the case of stress-related disease, Sarno believed that the very awareness of the dynamic of what was going on was sufficient to allow the individual the bodily relaxation, the mental fortitude, the emotional reassurance, all fact-based, that permitted a therapeutic episode to occur. And this is part of my inspiration for wondering whether a justified belief in and of itself in the selective capacities of thought is enough for us to enact those energies, which is, again, why I recently have been spending so much time and plan to spend more exploring the thesis of ESP telepathy, precognition, retro-causality, as those things have been practiced, documented, and statistically mapped out in laboratory settings. I want to give you an example of what I mean that I hope will prove useful. And then I want to provide you with another kind of example that goes outside the environs of the laboratory. I was contacted today by a professional MMA fighter, mixed martial arts fighter, and he had a match coming up in 9 days, and he wanted help getting into the right headspace for this match. He obviously trains very hard. If you're in mixed martial arts and you don't train very hard, you can remain in it for very long. And this is somebody who did a consulting session with me maybe about a year ago. And he got back in touch, kind of out of the blue, just saying, look, this is a really important fight to me. And I'm wondering if there's anything you can recommend that will help get me into the right headspace. And so I recommended to him something that I was just referencing, the 30-day mental challenge, which is an extraordinarily strong and powerful exercise. The fact that I didn't feel like doing it last night, I offer to you in an act of transparency, but I do plan on going back to it, and it does produce extraordinary results. It's just a very super simple exercise. I write about it in several of my books. I have a dedicated book that's coming out about it. It's the subject of an article that I posted at Medium, so it's not hard to find. Essentially, and I'm just going to boil it down to its basic specifics, there's a certain story that was told in the early 20th century by a scientist who was living in a remote town in California. He was nearing the age of 50. He was very lonely. He was very isolated. He was depressed. He was in despair because none of his works had been published. He felt he was frittering away his life in this desert town, not gaining much notice in the scientific community. And he said, you know, I could just feel a soul sickness encroaching upon me. And I had read some works of New Thought, and I had read some works by William James to the effect that a mental attitude that emphasizes the positive, the productive, the advancing can be an actual effective tool. And he said, I thought it was all just garbage, basically. But my heart was sick. I was lonely. My soul, as he put it, was sick. I really felt I had very little to lose at that point in my life. I was entering deep into middle age. And so in the scientific spirit of things, I just decided that I would make myself into a personal source of experiment and dedicate myself for a period of 30 days to focusing my thoughts on everything that was forwarding, advancing, positive. When thinking of the past, I would try to dwell on its desirable memories, episodes. In thinking of the present, I would try to direct my thoughts to those aspects of my present life that were justifiably positive, such as my feelings of isolation giving me a chance to pursue my work. In thinking of the future, I would consider every reasonable and possible ambition to be within reach. And he threw himself into this experiment. And he said, I very quickly found myself feeling better, and I was getting along with people better, but the outer events, he wrote, is what surprised me more. The outer events, he said, were really extraordinary. There was another scientist whose attention he deeply craved. And he said, this man wrote me from out of the clear blue, inviting me to become his assistant. He said, all my books were published. He said, I had a particular ambition that seemed too far out to realize. I hoped to be elected the head of a foreign scientific society. And I was, and this came to me. And he went through all this in great detail, and I felt great sincerity. So I took his experience and I condensed it down into what I felt was a faithful, actionable, a 30-day mental exercise, and thus the 30-day mental challenge. And I have done this challenge as recently, let's see, it must have been going back in September. And some really quite wonderful things did happen to me, and they happened to me early on. There was basically, to make a long story short, there was a certain financial windfall. There was a photographer I was very interested in getting to know. All these things that I was interested in seemed to come to me, and life was better, and it was happy, and it functioned along the lines of much of what appeared in that man's testimony. And I've had a lot of people write to me about this, so I take that exercise very seriously. So this fighter said to me, okay, you have something for me? And I said, well, yeah, look, I want you to do this 30-day mental challenge. And he said, okay, listen, I'm totally down with it, but I got this fight in 9 days. Do you got something that fits into the framework of that limited space of time? And I said, dig this, dig this. What you do after this fight is very likely to have an impact on your performance during the fight. The very pursuit of this 30-day mental challenge, while it's going to be perfectly good for you in the 9 days leading up to the fight, it's very, very likely that it will also benefit you retro-causally following the fight. And I sent him an article that I recently wrote called "Is Precognition Real?" And in this article, I write about the research of a cognitive psychologist at Cornell University named Darrell Bem. And I'm going to condense this because I've spoken of this before, and I don't want to spend an excessive amount of our time on it now. But in short, Bem, over a period of 10 years, conducted experiments into precognition. He conducted 9 different experiments. The most interesting and innovative and unprecedented, because these experiments, these kinds of experiments into precog have been done before, including by my friend Dean Radin at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. But the most dramatic original iteration of Bem's study was in experiments 8 and 9. And in experiments 8 and 9, he examined the prospect, dig this, of whether what you do in the future can have a positive effect on your performance in the present. Now, I have to say, when I speak of past, present, future, mentally, I'm expressing these things in quotation marks, because we, of course, have this sense that linearity is as real as the screen that you're looking at right now, as the words that you're hearing spoken right now. But linearity is conditioned. We know that linearity is conditioned. We know for a fact that Einstein's theories of relativity are provable, that space-time bends in conditions of extreme gravity, in conditions of extreme velocity, and it stands to reason that all of the data that's come out of quantum mechanics over the past, say, 80, 90 years dictates to us that because selection precipitates locality, there are infinite possibilities that exist as real actualities that would have happened if, well, not that would have happened, they exist, they're actual, there's an isness to them, that would have come to our attention locally based on whether an observer had elected to take a measurement 5 minutes earlier, 5 minutes later, and that a whole range of realities, past, present, future, unfold to us locally simply because someone elected to take a measurement at 1:29 p.m. Eastern time in Stamford, Connecticut. And if that person had taken that measurement one instance later, a whole other range of actualities, past, present, future, would have reached our attention, would have been localized, so to speak. In a way, this comports well with what is called chaos theory, which also comports with chaos magic. And that is that we live in this dynamically interrelated system at every level. And to change one minute fact of that system in and of itself can let loose a cascade of events that changes everything. This is the so-called this is the example that's sometimes used to demonstrate chaos theory is the proverbial butterfly flapping its wings in China and causing a hurricane in Texas. You know, I mean, chaos theory deals with that level of minutia, as does chaos magic. Anyway, that's a little bit of a digression because the point is all of this material is so fantastical, it can seem difficult to apply. So Bem, in his precog experiments, determined that he wanted to see whether you could actually make an application of a nonlinear, non-time-based formula for performance. So he structured a very simple experiment. He asked individuals to memorize a list of words and then just repeat back whatever words they could remember from this list. Very simple cognitive exercise. Somebody gives you a list of 10 words, memorize it for a few seconds. Okay, now repeat back to me what you remember. You might remember 5, 6, something like that. Fairly ordinary stuff. Then he added a wrinkle to the exercise, which is that you memorize your word list again, you recall whatever you're capable of recalling, and then a short time later in the future, you work on the list again. Invariably, across thousands and thousands of trials, what Bem found was that when he added the wrinkle of studying the list in the near future, what we call the future, the study participants did better on their cognitive exercise of recollection. So you memorize a word list, you get your score. Maybe it's 5 out of 10. You memorize the thing again in the near future. You do the whole thing over again. You know, you take your word test. You report your answers to the clinician. But with the added wrinkle that you're memorizing the thing again in the future. When that wrinkle is added, the recall effect spikes. It shows a statistically significant spike of just a few points, mind you, but repeatable over and over and over across thousands of subjects and trials. And so Bem published this paper on precognition. He referred to the effect as retro-causality. And it was published in a widely respected, peer-reviewed academic psychology journal. And this was in 2011. It met with howls of protest. There was one skeptic, Ray Hyman, who's a psychologist at the University of Oregon, and he told the New York Times, "It's craziness. It's pure craziness. It's an embarrassment to the entire field." And this was a little unusual, just a little, coming from Ray, because years ago he partnered with a great parapsychologist named Charles Honorton, and they meta-analyzed a series of experiments in telepathy. And at that time, I think through the force of Honorton's great intellect and sincerity, and Honorton has since died. Sadly, he died in 1996. These guys partnered back in 1986. That's a while ago. But Ray, back then, the old Ray, was very, he was not a believer in ESP, and he was never a believer in ESP. But he stated, I think, with great intellectual integrity, that these experiments in telepathy that the two scientists meta-analyzed were valid, and that there was no corruption in the data, there was no pollution in the data, there was no fraud, no misrepresentation, no laboratory mistakes, no glitches in the stats, and so on and so forth. And he said it warrants further study. And I thought, well, bravo, that's a real act of skepticism. That's a real act of skepticism, saying, listen, I've been over these books backwards and forwards, so to speak, and there's no pollution in them. I don't believe in the ESP thesis, but there's no pollution in them, so it warrants further study. What a great world we would live in if people were capable of bringing that level of intellectual integrity to discussions of anything, whether it's parapsychology or just ordinary social policy or what have you. But that was a long time ago. That was 86. And when Bem's paper came out in 2011, the same skeptic told the New York Times, it's craziness, pure craziness. And there was a range of really excoriating criticism, which I write about in my book, Daydream Believer, and you can also read about it in the article. I won't go over the greatest hits other than that one. Anyway, it was helpful to return to this material because 10 years on, Bem's efforts have been repeated by a wide range of clinicians. This was abetted by Bem himself because he opened up his database to anybody who asked. He provided to anybody who asked, free of charge, the software that he used to do the experiments, and he also provided an instruction manual. So anybody who was capable of clinical research, if they felt like it, could make an effort and wanted to put in the time, could make an effort to replicate Bem's experiments. Anyway, so about 10 years on, there's now a paper that Bem and his colleagues published, which was updated as recently as July of 2020, in which they meta-analyzed the data and found it confirmatory according to very strict and widely used social science methods. The database encompassed 90 studies from 33 different labs from 14 different nations, and pooled together, the result was confirmatory and upheld Bem's original research. So here we have this crazy situation, and Western science does not like this, where we have data that violates all common observation, and yet that stands up to the most widely used, commonly acknowledged methods of statistical analysis, and it proves confirmatory in a meta-analyzed pool of 90 studies, which is really quite large for papers that seek to meta-analyze studies. It's not easy to repeat studies, and there are many meta-analyses that draw upon a pool not half that large, that are widely accepted as canonical data within the social sciences. So this is a really significant meta-analysis, and it worked. On the whole, it proved confirmation of Bem's original precog experiments. I made reference to this in a talk earlier this year, and the talk was critiqued by the cognitive psychologist and best-selling author Steven Pinker. Pinker is an ESP rejectionist, and Pinker said, "Do you mean to say that a student can take a paper, get a grade, and then improve his or her grade by just studying afterwards?" And my response to that is, although I realize it's being framed in a way that's intended to be disadvantageous to my point, my response is yes. Yes, that is in fact what I am saying. It's not that the grade that the professor writes down somehow phenomenally changes. It's not that your B changes into a B plus because you've tried harder afterwards. No, that's not what Bem's experiments show. What Bem's experiments show is that improvements in cognitive performance show effect based upon a continuum of time that's not necessarily linear. That efforts expended in the so-called future, which I submit to you, persuasive as it seems, I assure you, we are stopping tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern time. We need a sense of linearity to navigate our way through life. It's necessary. So no worries, Dave. I'm not going to insist upon not stopping because time is illusory. But as overwhelmingly persuasive and necessary as a sense of linear time is, it is conceptual. It is conceptual. We've proven this on the cosmological scale, and Bem's gambit was to try to prove it on the psychological scale. So it is entirely possible, if one follows the logic of his experiments, that yes, my friend, the mixed martial arts fighter, can step into a ring, hopefully perform at his best based on the effort and the training that he's dedicated up to that point. But if his effort and training continue after the match, and training takes a lot of different forms. It's physical, it's mental, maybe it's studying your opponent's moves. I mean, there's many, many different forms that training can take depending on what you're doing. If he continues his efforts, at least according to the results from Bem's experiments, it stands to reason that he can improve aspects of his performance in a retro-causal manner. Now, I hope he prevails in the ring because he's my friend. I'm just going to, wave the flag for my team. I feel entitled to do that. And it may be that after the fight, he'll be too exhausted or he'll need recovery time and he's not just going to be able to throw himself right back into training, but that's no barrier whatsoever to using this exercise, which depends on the psyche, which is, I define the psyche as a compact of thought and emotion. Nothing stops you from using this exercise after the fight. So my encouragement was to him, yes, go ahead, do this exercise. It'll help you, I presume, leading up to the fight. And for the reasons that I've articulated, it'll help you, I presume, after the fight, because linearity is not absolute. Linearity is not absolute. And I think I get really attached to lab research, and there's probably several reasons for that. I have an enormous affection for some of the researchers. These are people who have, in many cases, really well-established academic careers. They have worked long and hard to establish their reputations, often in fields that have nothing to do with parapsychology. And they place their reputations at risk, not because they're trying to attract attention or trying to be provocative or get on television or something, but because they believe in a radical thesis and they decide to bring the excellence of their fields and their background to testing that thesis. And they are held up to terrible, terrible calumny, and they are branded sometimes as purveyors of pseudoscience on Wikipedia, and it's very painful. And yet they persist because they believe in following the integrity of their own search, and using the tools in which they've been trained. But I have also been criticized by friends for this approach. One of my mentors, Jeffrey J. Kripal, from Rice University, who is a scholar of religions and the associate dean of humanities at Rice. Jeff, who's a dear friend and a source of inspiration, has said to me, look, you are too attached to this whole laboratory empirical model. I can think of fewer places that you could go to make the ESP effect diminish that would do a better job of that than the laboratory. The linoleum tiled, white coated, fluorescent lit environs of the lab are the last place you want to go to test ESP. It's like going to the North Pole to look for zebras, although the way things are unfolding in our world, that might not be, such a strange gambit in a few years. But, Jeff felt that the lab model has taken us as far as we could go. And I'm not sure I agree with that, but his point is that we get better, more dramatic, more extraordinary results rather than these few points of statistical deviancy that I'm describing when the rubber hits the road, when there's stuff going on out in actual life. And so in that vein, I want to share with you a story of something that really happened to me. And I am not a guy who collects phenomena. I'm not really usually digging when people want to tell me about the fantastic experiences that have happened to them, because as I've said, it's almost like somebody showing you their vacation photos and it's like, oh, Jesus God, when is this going to be over? I mean, I'm glad you got to visit India and you can show me your vacation photos from India, but it's like, you're not there right now. Whatever those feelings were, they're cataloged into your memory. They're preserved in these, binary digital images, but it's not like, looking at this stuff where we're sort of transported to the thing itself. And yet people love collecting experiences sometimes. I don't dwell on experiences too much, but this is one that I really have to share with you. Years ago, I was involved in a very rigorous esoteric order with people of really fine intellect. And we made a tremendous effort to study a body of spiritual ideas. And very frequently, our activities involved entering into conditions of physical difficulty. And this was a really worthy pursuit, because very frequently in our world, we live in a kind of strange society where on one hand, people are suffering from poor self-image, ennui, depression, anxiety. They feel ill at ease with themselves, uncomfortable in their own skin. I'm persuaded, personally speaking, that in large measure, comes from a paucity of self-expression. But that's another issue. But then on the other hand, a lot of us, want to sort of strut around like peacocks. We use words like enlightened and realized and awakened and so forth. And people on Twitter are screaming at you, wake up, as if they're awake, And it's like, it's the height of ironies. And very frequently people will come into spiritual groups and they're there maybe because where they come from, they're sort of known as the wise owl, and they're the ones who are considered bookish and curious and interesting. And they're ready to sit down and start, teaching the Buddha about Buddhism. And you encounter this a fair amount. And the reason that we would put ourselves into conditions of physical difficulty was that it really helps you come face to face with limitations. And in my personal experience, nothing does more to puncture more quickly and more fully fantasies that we harbor of how terrific we are, how pumped up we are, how advanced we are, how well I understand the Tao Te Ching, how well I understand the Bhagavad Gita, than to be woken up in an unfamiliar place at an unfamiliar hour when it's cold and asked to do some moderately difficult task. And it's really extremely hard and much harder than it ought to be. So if you're on a camping trip and you're woken up at 4 a.m. and it's cold as hell out and you've only been sleeping for a few hours and you're told that somebody knocked over the latrine and 3 people have got to get up in the snow and go straighten it out, it's really hard. And it's harder than it should be. It's not what people go through in conditions of warfare or grinding poverty or not having clean water to drink. This is a comparative vacation, and yet it proves really hard. And it's funny, we've all been in workplaces or academia or other places where, you'll see somebody strutting up and down the hall in his or her suit or pantsuit or whatever, and they think, I'm awesome, I'm a real corporate warrior. Well, take that person, put them in a car on a lonely road near twilight where snow flurries are starting. There's no cell phone service. It's a mountainous area and they get a flat tire. Will they know what to do, or will they fall to pieces like a little kid? Most often the latter. And it's not even that hard a situation. When you think of people who got bombs falling on them in Ukraine, or caught in the midst of a terrible civil war in Syria or Yemen, or terrified of gang violence in Haiti. It's not that hard a situation. And yet most people out in the world who are strutting around like they're, just the king of the hill, all you got to do is just remove one little support beam from life, and they fall apart. They fall apart. And it's in all of us. It's in all of us. So these were among the reasons why we would put ourselves in conditions of physical difficulty. So you get a glimpse of yourself in a different way, and you don't forget it. So we were preparing for a winter camping trip, going on one of these suffering weekends, and we were preparing for a winter camping trip on the New York-Pennsylvania border. And the teacher, my teacher in this group, said to me, listen, I have a special task for you. The women in the group are going to sleep in tents outside in the dead of winter. The men are going to sleep inside this cold water cabin on the grounds. Probably not much warmer than the tent, but whatever it was, it was decided that the women were going to sleep in these tents out in the freezing cold. And he said, with a little bit of humor, he said, in order so that the women sleeping in these tents, if they have to get up in the middle of the night and go to the bathroom, don't have to venture out into the icy woods, you're going to go buy the equivalent of chamber pots for their tents. And the chamber pots that you have to buy are specifically to be heart-shaped pink buckets. Go buy heart-shaped pink buckets. And if you absolutely can't find heart-shaped pink buckets, you can get pink buckets of just a regular shape. And if you can't find those, then you can get red buckets of a regular shape. Now, this was in the days when Amazon was still a bookstore. This was a little while ago. So digital commerce wasn't such that I could just go online and buy pink heart-shaped buckets. I lived in Manhattan at the time. Today I'm in Brooklyn. And I decided to, go around to every hardware store, every Bed Bath store, every home goods store, every contractor store, and try to buy these heart-shaped pink buckets. And I came up completely blank. And it was really important to me to accomplish this task because although it had some humor attached to it, I recognized that I was being given this task for a purpose and it was intended to facilitate the experience of other people. And it was very, very important to me to get it right. And I tried so hard to find pink heart-shaped buckets. And I'm in New York City, it's not like I'm in some cow town somewhere. There's a lot of stores, a lot of contractor stores, a lot of paint stores, nothing. So then I tried to find the standard round pink buckets. Nothing. So then I'm like, well, all right, I'm just going to go to plan C and I'm going to find the red standard buckets. And I'm thinking, this cannot be hard. I have in my mind's eye a picture of red maintenance buckets, big deal, right? And I'm calling and I'm going to store after store after store. And everybody's like, nope, don't got them. And I don't want to belabor the point, but I really tried. And I also felt emotionally attached to this person. And I wanted to tell him, hey, I did a good job. And I failed, And so one day, and I had been really at this for about a week. Hey, what's up? I had really been at this for about a week or so. And I really tried. I put serious shoe leather and effort into it, made dozens of phone calls, visited dozens of places. I did everything I could do. Couldn't find the pink heart-shaped, couldn't find the pink standard bucket, couldn't find the red standard bucket, which felt ridiculous, considering that doesn't seem to be so tough an item. And so I had to go to this little nothing grocery store, like across the street from the apartment that I was in then, just to pick up some standard item. And I'm standing outside this grocery store and I'm thinking to myself, I've really made an effort and I'm just going to call my teacher and tell him, listen, I failed. I tried, but I failed. And something just told me, not yet. Just don't do it yet. Whatever. So I walk into this store. I must have been buying milk and or eggs or something. And I go to the back of the store where the frozen foods are. And in this nothing out of the, just side street grocery store, I go to the back to the cold food section. Right there is a brand new pile of 10 or so pink heart-shaped buckets. And this is what happened. So I grab a stock boy and I'm like, am I seeing things? Are these pink heart-shaped buckets? He's like, yeah. And it's like, when did these come in? And he's like, they came in today. And he's like wanting to get away from the crazy man. And everything that I've just repeated to you is exactly how it happened. The level of effort that I put in, the emotion that was attached to the outcome, because I was very dedicated to trying to make it work. And the discovery of these objects just before I was going to call my teacher and say that I failed in this nothing out of the way little grocery store. It was the D'Agostino's, for anybody who's wondering if there are any New Yorkers in the house. It violated any law that is measurable by any actuarial table. There's just no statistical model that could cover this network of events. And I can't tell you what happened. I can't tell you what happened. I can only say that I don't use the term manifestation very much because I don't find it very clear, just in the same way that I don't use the word soul because I don't find it very clear. I favor the term selection for some of the reasons that I've been describing, apropos of taking a measurement, using mental perspective, and so forth. And this occurred. This occurred. I don't know that anything quite like that will occur again in my life, but it doesn't mean that it did not occur. I know that I had very deep emotional stakes attached to it. It was not a life or death situation. Maybe in a certain sense, it helped me that it was not a life or death situation, because I wouldn't have suffered any catastrophe. I just would have told my teacher that I failed. I would have felt perhaps some shame over it. And I would have been disappointed that I couldn't fulfill this task that fed the efforts of the trip. But it did happen. It did happen. And it blew me away, and it created an indelible reference point for me. And I guess that's what Jeff Kripal is talking about when he says, look, you're so fascinated with the lab and these few points of deviancy from the norm, but the much more extraordinary and dramatic examples that we possess can be found outside of a laboratory framework. And I share that just to attest to one of them in my existence. Now, the group that I was part of was dedicated to the ideas of the spiritual philosopher G.I. Gurdjieff. And Gurdjieff was a philosopher, I think, of just the deepest and profoundest gravity. And he had a formula of sorts that I want to share with you. And I hope you'll take it very, very seriously, because how can I put this? I often say that we discover profundity only in application. We hear things all the time that make sense to us, but we never really try them. Like people will say, don't lie, it's good not to lie. And we all sort of agree with that, of course, but we do lie. We lie to get out of emotional difficulties. We lie because, we don't want our optometrist to think we're flaky. So we tell him, I didn't forget that this happened, and we do it all the time. And of course, those are very innocent examples. Some of us lie in much more profound and violative ways, or have been lied to in profound and violative ways. So, or we hear an expression like know thyself. Actually, it's the slogan of East West Books. Isn't that right? And of course, it's a noble, wonderful expression with very deep roots in the greatest of ethical philosophies in Western culture. And yet it's so familiar that we're apt to neglect it. What does it really mean to know thyself? It's infinitely easier for me to get pissed off and, spend 90 minutes thinking about somebody who broke his word to me, rather than how I've broken my word to people, or how I've hurt people through some sort of negative emotional outburst or something, not meaning to hurt them, but most assuredly hurting them. And so I'm saying this because when I tell you this brief story from the annals of Gurdjieff's work, I urge you to take it with the deepest seriousness, because he was a man, I believe, who subjected himself, in some cases, to really just tremendous suffering to try to bear out the validity of ideas. And he would never, in my estimation, say anything off the cuff or in a kind of casual way. He would never offer a stump speech, as I was saying at the beginning. He may have had great weaknesses. He may have had great flaws, but he told the truth. And so I want to share this story with you. And it sort of bears on the little story that I just told a moment ago. Gurdjieff and a circle of his students were pursuing the study of his ideas in pre-revolutionary Russia. And this was during the First World War. So things were very difficult, very difficult. Then the Bolshevik Revolution breaks out and everything is just chaos. And, you know, we refer to the Russian Revolution as just that, a revolution, but it was actually a civil war that went on for a lot of years, and there were competing factions. There were so-called white Russians who were loyal, more or less, to the Tsar, and they were still fighting the Bolsheviks for many, many years, and it was chaotic, and food was in short supply, and it was physically very dangerous. And so Gurdjieff and a circle of his students, some of whom had been attached to the old system of government, they had to flee. They had to flee Russia. A number of them were in danger for their lives. And so he and his circle made their way across Eurasia. And they were seeking to get to Constantinople, as it was then called, or other environs that would prove safer and more stable. And they split up into smaller groups because it was just safer, less attracting of attention if you were traveling in a small group rather than, say, 100 people. So they splintered off into smaller groups, and each of these little groups had to make their way to Constantinople or other environs. And eventually, Gurdjieff and a circle of his students settled down, and they were in a situation, to make a long story short, where they were in terrible need financially. They just had no money, and they were encamped in Constantinople without resources, and things were desperately, desperately difficult, and they were entirely without help and without resources. And another group who made their way across Europe out of the Russian territories and hinterlands showed up, and Gurdjieff's mother was actually part of that group. And they were in a situation where financially they were just on the brink of collapse and would not have appropriate money for food, for shelter, and so forth. And they made every effort they could to earn money, to do whatever was possible. And the efforts that they put in were really just Herculean. I mean, just enormous, enormous efforts. But the crisis was unabated. And Gurdjieff was sitting in his room one day, and he just felt like, this is all just going to fall apart. This is a catastrophe, and I just don't know what I'm going to do. I just don't know what I'm going to do. And it was a time of despair. And suddenly his mother walks into the room, and she said, look, there's this thing I've been carrying with me since I arrived. She had just arrived, very, very recent. And she said, I want to give this to you because I just want to be unburdened from carrying this thing. And he said, well, what is it? And she hands him a handkerchief, and he undoes the handkerchief. And inside the handkerchief is this very, very valuable brooch with some sort of a precious stone in it, a gem, some very, very precious stone. And he suddenly realizes that they're saved. They're saved. He can barter the brooch with the precious gem for money, and it's going to alleviate their financial problems. And he said, he distantly recalled having given this valuable brooch to his mother when they left Russia, but he gave it to her for the purposes of bartering it for food or using it for bribery if they got into a tough spot. He never gave another thought to it. He thought it had long since been sold for food or shelter or to bribe a border guard or something of that nature. And he said, I completely had forgotten all about it. And here's my mother just arrived, walking into my room saying, here, take this thing from me. I no longer want to be burdened with carrying this around. And the whole crisis, which was of the profoundest sort, was lifted. And he said, I could have stood up at that moment and literally just danced and spun around with joy. And he said, you know, I detected something lawful in this incident. And he wrote, and this is in his book, Meetings with Remarkable Men. He wrote an addendum to Meetings with Remarkable Men called The Material Question. And that's where this episode appears. And in The Material Question, he wrote, there was something lawful in this turn of events. And he wrote of his absolute conviction that continual persistence in the direction of a well-focused aim with all of one's capacities, emotional, physical, intellectual, brought to bear with unerring focus and consistency in the direction of a single aim will lawfully produce a result in a way that goes beyond cognition, motor skill, physicality, that there is a naturally lawful, or if one wants to put it this way, metaphysically lawful compact that delivers us almost like a pendulum swinging from one place to another to the actualization of an event, if focused on with the totality of one's capacities, physical, mental, emotional. And when I read that, I thought to myself, how quickly one is tempted to throw away that lesson so as to say, oh, so it's like persistence. Well, as a friend of mine in the Gurdjieff work used to put it, it's not like anything. You just have to let it be. Too frequently, and we're inured to doing this in daily life, we're inured to doing this on social media, we turn things into synonyms, or we reframe things into language with which we feel familiar, as though to reassure ourselves, I got it, I understand. But the only way to understand is through the experience itself. And then I think one realizes why Gurdjieff was saying it's lawful, it's lawful. And one of the things I value from my time in that work is that people of great substance would sometimes say very simple things that one could easily overlook, if not for the totality of the experience. And there was a woman in the work who knew Gurdjieff as a little girl, and she made the point of saying, look, sometimes, you try and you try and you try, and you're just at that point of despair, and then you find exactly what you need. And she was making reference to that lawful quality. And we can always try to connect the dots behind us, but some of these things that occur are so off the books in terms of being measurable that one can only just let them be. That's what I experienced in my pink bucket story. How any of this happened, I don't understand. And I don't know that we in our generation will understand. To move things back in the direction of the laboratory, if you function within the Western scientific model, pretty soon you face the question of causation. And usually causation gets expressed as a theory. So if you're going to function within that world, you got to accept the imperative to arrive at a theory. And we don't have a theory of ESP, for example, We don't have precisely a theory of precognition or of retro-causality. We don't exactly have a theory of selectivity, as I've described it. But people are struggling, it seems to me, to come up with theories, and their exercise is worthy, is really, really worthy. For example, nowadays you'll hear people talk about string theory, which is a model of reality, not reality itself, but a model in which it's posited that everything that is exists along these undulating bands of strings that crisscross through different intersections of time, and something that goes on outside of our sensory purview in a so-called other intersection of time or other dimension can affect what's going on in our own dimension. So for example, this might be a way of explaining the so-called mirror effect, where objects on both a particulate level, a particle level, and a macro level, a cosmic level, affect one another at great distances without any clear connection. And we're really good as a human community of measuring these things, but we still don't know what's going on. We just know that there's an isness, something is occurring, but we don't know why a particle reverses its magnetic polarity or reverses its electrical charge, and another particle at a great distance does the same thing with no apparent causality. This is what Einstein referred to as spooky action at a distance in a somewhat derisive way. He was very frustrated with the absence of causation or a theory. So I think that the generation of people, call them what you wish, who take an interest in these things, I think if one is going to function within the scientific model, the lab model, it is necessary to have a theory or at least some estimation of causation, even if it's wrong, so that people can build on it. And I personally believe that it's helpful to the individual, because as I was saying at the beginning of the presentation, the justified belief in the extraphysical, in the causative properties of your psyche, that justified, supportable, defensible belief can in and of itself be sufficient, I believe, to enact some of the energies that we've been describing. And this is a part of the uncertain place that I allude to in the title of this essay collection. We are in this peculiar, uncertain place of having all this testimony, all this evidence, all this data, and yet we're on our knees peeking through a keyhole with very limited peripheral vision, not able to really know what is going on here. But that it is going on, we have no doubt. And for the individual seeker, the only empiricism really, and in truth, the only empiricism that matters is result in conduct and in experience, and in experience, conduct and experience. You know, what else have we to measure progress, if I can put it in those terms, on the spiritual path, progress in our search for the extra-physical? And I feel very strongly that no one is entitled to take this away from you, which is why you need to choose your company very, very carefully. The Italian novelist Ignazio Silone said, "What is basic in life is the choice of one's comrades." And it's very important to be around people with whom you can have an exchange about these things. It's very important to keep some things, I believe, to yourself. because this whole business of saying confirmation bias, law of large numbers, whatever other terms are, clinically in vogue, would serve to deprive us of the search, would serve to deprive us of the search. Great beings, from Lao Tzu to the Buddha, to Proust, to Sylvia Plath, to Gurdjieff, would be told that, oh, well, tut tut, sorry, that's just confirmation bias, suggestion, prejudice, whatever. It's as if the whole human search could be boiled down to a forced choice marketing questionnaire in a lab or a consumer lab somewhere. But of course, only you as an individual can evaluate the emotional stakes of what you're experiencing. And there are things that occur that would be said to be impossible, all but literally, but for the fact that they actually occurred. There's a guy, a forest ranger from Virginia, who I write about in Daydream Believer. He's now dead. He was struck by lightning 7 times. And I crunched the numbers. The chances of being struck by lightning several times are so infinitesimally small, it's literally difficult to even express them. And if you were to propose to a statistician or an emergency medical care doc, although more likely the statistician, the emergency medical care doc would probably be like, yeah, I've seen everything. But if you were to propose this to a clinician, what if there was a guy who was struck by lightning 7 times? It would seem like nothing but the merest of mental exercises, because it'd be like, you know how rare it is to be struck by lightning twice? You can't even measure 7 times, and you can't. It's impossible. But for the fact that it actually happened. The guy is in Guinness Book of Records, or you can read about the stats in Daydream Believer. So, yes, extraordinary things happen. And when these extraordinary things happen, the one component that statistics can never measure is the intimacy of their meaning to you, the individual. So I really want to encourage experiment. I believe that a valid conviction as to the realness of mental causation helps us on our path. It abets and aids these experiences, just as the knowledge therapy model that John Sarno, the orthopedist, was using. And I'll say one final word before opening things up to exchange. And that is another facet of Uncertain Places. And I want you to feel this as an exquisite freedom. We are frequently told on the spiritual path that we need to verify everything for ourselves. But human nature being what it is, when that is said to us, usually what the person saying it means is, go off, think about this, and when you agree with exactly my perspective, come back, and then we'll move on to the next thing. But if you come back and you don't agree with their perspective, you see how quickly unraveling relationships come to be. We want to impose our will on other people. We want to tell other people what to do. We discover something maybe that's true for ourselves, or maybe that we just like repeating, usually the latter, I suspect, and we want other people to repeat it too. But it falls to us on the path within the seeking community to verify everything, Familiarity is not truth. Just because something has been repeated as a hallowed truth for centuries and centuries and centuries, all that means is that it's familiar, that it's culturally habitual. It may be true, But you need to find out in your own existence, within this limited time that we're aware of having, whether in fact it is true. And so many concepts in every culture get so heavily repeated that we almost literally can't think outside of them. They're almost like drawing breath. They feel so natural. And the very notion of questioning these things angers people who don't even have any stake in our search. What does my neighbor Mike care whether I'm prepared to forgive someone or not? But if I enunciate my questions about forgiveness as a model, Mike gets pissed off. Mike wants to say to me, well, you don't forgive someone for them, you forgive them for yourself. And it's like, well, thank you. I'll remember that at my 12-step meeting next week, but I need to verify that for myself. I need to verify that for myself and hopefully provide my neighbor with the same freedom to do so. We in the West think in terms of opposites, higher, lower, heaven, hell, God, devil, so forth and so on. There's a million different terms that can be used to reflect that hierarchical scale of opposites that we think in. But it's just a concept of reality. It's purely conceptual. You ask me to point up and I go like this. But if somebody's watching tonight from Sydney, Australia, that's meaningless to him. I mean, literally so. These are just concepts of reality. They may be right and they may be good, but you, the individual, in the exquisite privacy of your own search, have got the internal freedom to test these concepts within your own sphere. And of course, nothing is without consequence, nothing is without debt, and we have relationships to maintain. Relationships are the fabric of life itself. So this is not a call to be frivolous. This is not a call to just do whatever you want. I mean, you can, but you'll also have to bear the consequence of that. But within the framework of the search, there's so much that we can do, including as just internal movements themselves, that abet our efforts to verify, to test, to find out. So one experiment that I proposed was finding out for yourself whether the holding of the wish with absolute conviction and emotional passion, it's not something that can be faked, is in itself sufficient to bring to bear the actualization of the event, the relationship, the thing itself that you seek. We're afraid of uncertainty. I'm afraid of uncertainty. And yet, in matters of the search, make uncertainty your great, great, great friend, because it allows you to ask the broadest range of questions without anyone else's approbation or approval. And that's my deepest, deepest wish for everyone gathered here tonight. So I thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure to be able to share this with you. And we have a decent stretch of time for questions, exchange, comments. And I told Dave at the beginning that since we're an intimate group, I don't want to go through the formality of putting your question in the chat box. So if you wish to do so, you're very entitled to. But if you wish to ask a question, please do so. You can leave your camera on, you can leave your camera off. I am planning to post this later on. So if you don't want to be on camera, just flick it off. That's totally cool. But I'd love to hear from you, anything at all, and I'll turn the mic back over to Dave.
Wow, well, I couldn't think of a better guide, Sherpa, to the land of uncertain places than you, Mitch. And that was a fantastic talk and
Thank
really
you.
kind of inspiring because I know that a lot of people through the process of the last couple of years have gone through some extraordinarily tough and difficult times. Again, I think probably proving your thesis to themselves and in odd ways, but really begin to engage with the practice that you so eloquently spoke of today. Was something
Thank
that we
you.
can all look forward to doing more of.
Thank you.
Jennifer, you had a hand raised. That's great.
Oh, she might need to be unmuted.
Okay, can you
Okay,
hear
yeah.
me now?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, all right. Hi, I
Hey,
have, thanks for tonight, this was great.
thank you. Thanks for being here.
I've had a question building for a while, tried to look for myself. Is there a way to see Daryl Bem's list of the words that he gave to the participants?
Oh, that's a great question, and I don't know. I suspect there is. I've been through all his papers and so forth. Let me make a specific inquiry to that effect, and I'm sure that that's doable. Absolutely, yeah.
Cool. I think it would make a great T-shirt. I'm not just saying.
Right. I agree. I think of a lot of T-shirts these days. That
yeah, but
yeah,
I actually just
yeah.
want to see it. Are there patterns? Is there any? I'm curious. I've heard about the list so many times. Now I'm
Yeah,
like,
that's a
I
terrific
want to see it
question.
myself. Yeah,
Yeah, I'll see if I can find that, and if I do, I'll post it and I'll contact you with it. Yeah, great
wonderful.
question.
Thank you.
Absolutely, sure thing. Great to see you. Yeah, and Merle, you had a question.
Hi, Mitch.
Hey.
When you talk about selecting, as you did with the pink heart-shaped buckets, do you think about or believe in individual entities that we might call spirit guides or angels that put thoughts into our head? Or does that all come from within and from our passion to select?
That's a wonderful question. I do feel that there is invisible help, if I can put it that way. That's a theosophical term, but it's a term I've always liked. I do feel there's invisible help in the form of other intelligences that may exist. If I can use the string theory metaphor along these undulating strings, I do engage in prayer. I do seek relationships with deities. And I think that there's a very interesting creative tension between the wish and action. And sometimes we'll feel motivated to do something, and that motivation, while it might seem very commonsensical from one point of view, wasn't there before. You know, there's a historian that I was thinking about last night who just wrote a wonderful book on Hermeticism. And I've never really been in touch with him. And I thought, I really want to be in touch with this guy. And what should I do? And then I realized, oh, you know, we have a mutual friend. And then I reached out to the mutual friend. It's a fairly ordinary thing in and of itself. And yet it didn't occur to me until much later in the evening that I actually had a mutual friend. So, you know, it seems to me that when something reaches us, it reaches us through established channels. It's not as if this guy that I want to talk to is just going to materialize in my room one night, although, you know, there are such stories in the annals of theosophy and other Western and Eastern occult traditions. But the greater likelihood, it seems to me, is that stuff reaches us through established channels. So the pink buckets don't show up in my living room. They show up, very surprisingly, in this kind of rundown little neighborhood grocery store, but there they are. The guy that I want to talk to doesn't just show up out of the clear blue, but I think, oh, you know, I'm 1 degree of separation from this guy through a friend who I really love, and I know he knows him. So, you know, so it seems to me that what we call inspiration, which the ancient Romans used to feel was really something that came from another place, could come from a relationship to another intelligence or entity. There was a Roman term, genii, a Latin term for a spirit, and this in Arabic became genie. And a genii was thought to be a kind of a spirit entity that would imbue us with inspiration, that would imbue us with that eureka moment or some breakthrough when we're struggling to solve a problem. Or and within Roman metaphysics, that was thought to be a receipt of something. a receipt of something that was extra cognitive. Emanuel Swedenborg thought very much the same thing. Neville Goddard frequently makes that point. You know, he talks about a bridge of incident, kind of focusing on something, and then there'll be a bridge of incident that will get you there. And that bridge of incident may be a kind of inspiration, or a moment of clarity, or a eureka moment, or what have you. And I would take such things with great seriousness. You know, it's funny, in our culture, we're of course apt to describe these things as just ordinary cognitive processes, but we don't know that. You know, because something has one property to it, we assume that that's the only thing going on. You know, people will sometimes say of the placebo response, oh, well, it's nothing but endorphins being released in the body, or it's nothing but inflammation reducing enzymes being released. Okay, maybe that's what the prayer appeal looks like in the body. Maybe that's what hopeful expectancy looks like in the body. That's the thing that's measurable. There may be 12 other things going on. So I take that very seriously, and I think it's really worth seeking ideas and inspiration in just that way. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Hey, Mitch, by the way, I heard you with George and Ori on Coast to Coast earlier in the week. What a great talk that was.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
It was amazing.
I love talking to George because we can discuss the most far out topics, and he's just like, well, how do you like that? And, you know, he's just so wonderfully welcoming, you know, in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, he is. Thank you, Mitch. This was great.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
We have a wonderful question in the chat from Tyler. Good evening, Mitch. It seems that many of the common religions of the past have simply run out of steam for the human species very suddenly, with so many of us feeling a gap, a space that is no longer filled in the spirit. Do you feel that we are on the cusp of a new age, and in that new age, a new understanding of spirituality?
It may be possible. I mean, I have in the past resisted speaking in terms of new ages or new paradigms or shifts in consciousness, because I always found that to be such a trope of new age culture, and I resisted signing on to that. I also didn't see evidence of it, but now I feel like there is evidence of it, and I think that I haven't even mentioned things like the mainstreaming of the UFO thesis, for example, you know, which sort of serves to poke holes in the straight story in ways that I think are very helpful. And if we are able to start to talk in terms of extra physical experience, or at least experience that violates all common observation, and it's just occurring, it's just happening, it may liberate us from some of the outer forms to which we have been so wed as a human community for so long. When I was a kid, I grew up within a traditional Jewish household, and I had an Orthodox bar mitzvah. And that was very enriching for me until I was in my early 30s, and it stopped being enriching. And I remember I would be in services at a synagogue, and I'd be thinking about, where am I going to go to lunch after? And I'd be fidgety. And I thought, you know, something's wrong here. I'm not feeling engaged. There was something about the communal, spiritual, congregational experience, the liturgy, beautiful as it is, that was not engaging me. And I didn't feel a sincerity within myself. I didn't feel an attachment to it. And, you know, I have spent time, as I'm sure many of you have, within congregational settings, and if they work for people, that's wonderful. But for me personally, that was not fortifying, and so I began to go outside and search and search. And I don't have any brief against traditional religion or any brief against mainstream religion at all. But if I found it fortifying, I would participate in it, and I don't. And there are obviously increasing numbers of people who feel that way. And for traditionalists, small t, that's considered a problem. they think, oh boy, you guys, you're all just engaged in cafeteria religion and blah, 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 blah. And I don't take that seriously at all, because my feeling is, look, we as a human community for millennia have been selecting ideas from within different ethical and religious traditions without necessarily being part of those traditions. I often point out to people nowadays, there's this current vogue in being into Stoicism, the philosophy of Stoicism. Well, the Stoics were also part of a pantheistic religious system. Marcus Aurelius worshiped Jupiter. You don't have to worship Jupiter, although you might want to try, to participate in Marcus's thought. So nobody's like, you're cherry picking. You should be part of a traditional Jupiterian worship circle because that's what Marcus did. It's ridiculous. It's only because so much time has passed that we see how unnecessary that is to avail ourselves of the meditations of Marcus Aurelius. And this is true over and over and over. You can read the Tao Te Ching without putting a label on your back that says, I'm a Taoist, or whatever that is. I mean, what is more classically Buddhist than not being part of any system? Isn't the whole point that you're trying to get beyond the liturgy, the hierarchy, the congregation? And so, what is derided as cafeteria religion has been going on across millennia. I'm not a Hindu, but I participate in transcendental meditation. Now, transcendental meditation is a Vedic method that came from the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, that came from his teacher, and they were Vedic monks. But the Maharishi didn't say to anybody, well, now, you have to convert to Hinduism. I mean, the technique is offered, and if the technique is useful, then the individual uses it, And so I think there's probably a hastening of this process going on, and we'll see where it leads to. But I think those experiments are wonderful. And if they get a person somewhere, then you share what you found, and somebody else may have that experience.
Absolutely.
Deborah had a
Deborah,
question?
yeah.
I think she needs to be unmuted.
Hi,
Hi, Deborah.
hi, Mitch. Your authenticity and genuineness really shines through, and I really appreciate that. Thank you for your presentation. And I get a little nervous talking in front of groups, so I apologize to everyone.
Not at all.
But I was just wondering, I tried to write a few notes since I get a little nervous. I guess what I'm trying to say is I've had some experiences. Some of them occurred when I was much younger, and I won't, of course, this isn't the place or the time. I'll be very brief, but some of them occurred within about the past 2 years when I saw both of my parents pass away. Literally, I was a few feet in front of them. And since that time, I've also gone through just massive changes in my life and had odd occurrences, kind of like what you had mentioned, things that would just sort of show up unexpectedly. And it was like following a breadcrumb trail of really strange things, I think, taking me to some kind of understanding about my life. But I understand this isn't about me. The point that I'm trying to make is I've always really struggled to find, I know how you talked about being careful about who is with you and finding a group. And for me, that seems to be a common theme of my life, is like trying to find a tribe, like not really ever being able to find that. And even within the spiritual community, sometimes it's really hard to find someone who will just listen to your experiences. I've tried to process them, but not even just processing them, but just for me to be heard and acknowledged would have value in and of itself. But it's just been such a struggle. And I wonder, like, are there other people who struggle with this too? And where do we find resources? I hope that's not a silly or ridiculous question.
No, not at all. I mean, I hope gatherings like this one, provide a valuable exchange and provide a kind of resource. A lot of people do write to me asking, hey, I live in Los Angeles or I live in San Antonio. Do you know of any groups I can connect with in the area? And in my personal experience, having been doing this for a while, there aren't many. I I was involved myself with the Gurdjieff work for about 8 years. And I reached a point where, for various reasons, I had to leave, although I value it enormously. I have not found much in the way of groups. And that, I guess, leads me to a certain question. Years ago, I had asked the philosopher Jacob Needleman, where are all the great teachers today? These iconic figures like a Rudolf Steiner or Madame Blavatsky or a Gurdjieff or so on and so forth. It seems like we don't have these really iconic spiritual teachers in our era. And he said, well, that's true. It may be that we don't at the present live in an age of great teachers, but we have the group. And I really resonated to that. And I really dug what he said. I'm starting to wonder at this instant if maybe we're even passing out of the group era at this point. And maybe the individual practitioner with resources that are found along the way is the name of the game in terms of our generation. Just personally speaking, I have very few friends. I have a partner. I have 2 kids. One of them is in the next room. And my social circle doesn't go too much beyond that. I have a couple of old friends. I don't see them, frankly, that much. I'm working a lot. And so if I'm not with my kids or with my partner or with a very old friend or maybe somebody that I'm just seeing for some professional, reason, my circle of relationships is quite small. But my search, I feel, has been rich. And it seems to me that no company is much better than bad company. It's infinitely better to be nobly alone than it is to settle for bad company. And we've all spent so much time in bad company just because human nature is what it is. I remember one time I was sitting in some restaurant on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and there were these 2 women at a table adjacent to mine, and I wasn't trying to overhear their conversation or anything. It was just that we were scrunched so close it was unavoidable. And they were having a perfectly normal conversation, which was almost just like background noise. But there was a point in the conversation where one woman said to the other, you are so mean to me. And the other person, her quote unquote friend, said, of course, I don't know what you're talking about, which is always what bullies do. There's always that plausible denial. You're too sensitive. You're being defensive. I don't know what you're talking about, And I felt my heart go out to the woman that was making that statement, saying, you're so mean to me, because I felt she was telling the truth. I felt she was telling the truth because I believe that we've all been in situations where our so-called friends shoot stealth missiles across the table at us, and we're so shocked because it comes out of the clear blue. We're having this perfectly normal conversation, and then we're stealthily told something that makes us feel very small. And it is a real violence. It is emotional violence. And I feel that within our families, within our workplaces, within our so-called friendships, save us from our friendships, a lot of cruelty is directed at us. And I think that we need to be very, very selective about who we confide in, who we associate with, who we are friends with. And obviously, loneliness can at times be painful. But there are ways to allay that pain, and there are approaches that we can take, such as maybe making ourselves available for a very limited frame of time for an event or for a social get together or whatever, which is balm for the spirit, it seems to me. I mean, we do need to be in some kind of exchange, but I think we can be very exacting and very selective, and be sure that the company that we're in treats us right. Because I think there are a few things that are more withering to the spirit than to feel misunderstood, unseen, unappreciated. And I do think that being nobly alone is vastly, vastly better than settling, for those kinds of situations. And I think, and I hope on the spiritual path, there are just enough gatherings like this one, where people are at liberty to speak freely, and there's a sense, I think, of shared values, where we can open up for one another, and then we can go back, into our private lives. I remember there was a spiritual organization that I used to be part of until they kicked me out because I was too controversial, where they had like a learning center, and they didn't have like dormitory facilities, like overnight facilities. So people would stay at hotels and stuff. And I liked that model because I thought it's really nice to be able to sort of do your thing and then retreat back into your private life and just have your own world, wherever it is you want to do, whether you want to watch television or go to the restaurant or whatever it is you feel like doing. And then you'll go back, when you wish. And I think that the path can be that way, and that we can participate, in those things that seem up to the level of our expectations, where we feel seen, where we feel heard, where we feel respected, and then just go back into private life. So it may be that also what's dawning right now is a model where, okay, we had the great teachers, we had the group, a lot of good things came out of that, the recovery groups and so forth, very positive developments, it seems to me. And then this may be the age of individual experiment. I hope that's useful.
Thank you. I'm just kind of shocked because to me, it seems like not just for me, but, the sharing is so important. And it just seems like people just don't want to listen to each other, and they just miss so much because, I understand we're all rushing everywhere and we have a million things we need to do, but it just seems like we're just missing so much by, not listening to each other.
I dig. Well, sometimes that listening can occur just through one intimate friend who may show up tomorrow, I mean, I don't mean that in a glib way. I referenced William James earlier. I was quoting him from his essay, Is Life Worth Living, which he wrote in 1895. At the time, there was a wave of suicide sweeping America, mostly among young men, and nobody knew why. And still nobody knows why, but it was just one of these societal things that was going on. And James wrote this essay to try to persuade people that life is worth living, and he made many, many points. But one of the points that he made in this essay was, look, and this is going to sound kind of casual, but he didn't mean it casually, and I certainly wouldn't offer it casually. He said, can you stand it for 24 hours more? Because 24 hours can bring a revolution, apropos of Gurdjieff's story, 24 hours can bring just something extraordinary. And sometimes just perhaps, finding that one individual, whoever that person may be, with whom you feel understood and can communicate and share experiences, that may be worth a whole lifetime of groups and circles and so forth. Just a suggestion. I only say that because it's been that way for me. And I assume nothing in my life is like exceptional to my life alone. You know, we all kind of share in a common existence. And it could be that what you're seeking will be fulfilled just through one relationship. And I think that can be enough. I hope
Thank
that's
you so
helpful.
much.
Of course.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you so much.
For
Thank you to
sure.
everyone here too. Thank you.
Thank you. And I
Oh,
think
great.
Deborah had a question.
No,
I see a hand raised.
oh no, that was Deborah.
That was
And
Deborah. Oh, I'm so sorry, Deborah. I beg your pardon. I was looking in the participants box and your hand was still up. So I was asking of it. Was there anything else that anybody had on their minds? Okay, cool.
that was
Well,
a
thank you. You know, appreciate it being here with y'all.
well, thank you, Mitch. That was incredibly fulfilling talk
Thank you.
this night, and I think a lot of people feel that
Thank you.
way. And
Thank you.
of course, I'm going to have to say, go out and grab a copy of Uncertain Places if you haven't already. But also all of Mitch's work. It's an incredible corpus of very self-empowering stuff, and it would just do you wonders. And from all of us at East West Books in Mountain View, thank you so much, Mitch, for being here again, and
Thank you.
always a pleasure.
Thank you all. Wonderful to be in touch with you. I know some of you through social media. I know some of you in 3D, and we'll all be together again. And thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you much.
Good night. Be well. Thanks.
Thank you.